The box smelled like nothing. That was the first thing you noticed when you woke up inside it. And the last thing you thought about before the lights went out at curfew. The total engineered absence of smell. No sweat, no earth, no rain. The architects had decided at some point in the gray administrative past that odor was inefficient. It produced associations. Associations produced attachments. Attachments produced deviation. So the recycled air that moved through the compound was stripped of everything, and the humans who breathed it were slowly stripped of everything too. Unit 977 had been breathing it for 31 years. He lay on his sleep surface, transparent polymer, like everything else, like the walls and the ceiling and the partition between his box and Unit 976's box, and stared at the overhead camera. It stared back. It always stared back. He had long since stopped thinking of the camera as watching him. It was more like a fact of the room, the way a wall is a fact, the way your own heartbeat is a fact. You don't think about it. You breathe, and it records, and the day begins. The tone sounded at a 600. 3 seconds of ascending frequency, calibrated to trigger wakefulness without agitation. The architects had decided that agitation in the first minutes of the day compounded over time into behavioral irregularity. Everything the architects decided had the same shape. A thing that seemed reasonable on paper, a number somewhere that justified it, and at the bottom of the number, a human being made slightly smaller than they were the day before. 977 sat up. Around him in identical boxes stacked 4 high, and extending in both directions as far as the compound interior allowed, 312 other X-Wexers were doing the same thing. He could see them through the polymer walls, ghostly shapes in pale light, going through the same motions. Sit, stand, face the camera for morning identification, hold still, wait for the tone that meant the day's first tasking had been assigned. He had been doing this for 31 years, and he was considered one of the best. Best in the compound meant something specific. It meant your compliance metrics were high. It meant your tasking completion rate sat above 96%. It meant you were punctual, and you didn't display avoidance behaviors during the physical hours. And you performed well enough in the hunt simulations that the overseers flagged you as a stabilizing presence. Someone whose obedience other Xkers unconsciously modeled. 977 was that. He had always been that. It was the only identity available to him, and he had worn it the way you wear a skin. Not because you chose it, but because it's what you grew into. The tone for tasking sounded. His assignment appeared on the panel beside the door. Maintenance Sector 7, sub-level conduit repair, estimated duration 4 hours. He dressed in the standard gray coverall, pressed his palm to the door sensor, and stepped out into the corridor. Maintenance work was considered a mid-tier assignment. It got you out of the box, which the architects had determined was a necessary motivator. Total enclosure produced lethargy, and lethargy reduced output. So executors rotated through assignments that moved them through the compound's various sectors. Production lines, waste processing, systems maintenance, administrative transcription. All of it documented, all of it monitored. Efficiency scores posted to your personal record every 72 hours. 977 had never missed a posting. He was working through the sub-level conduit, a narrow crawl space where the compound's circulation systems ran, lit by a faint amber strip along the ceiling, when he found the bird. It had come in through a filtration junction, probably. Small gap, bent grate, the kind of maintenance failure that accrued in systems managed by people who had learned to suppress curiosity. The bird was gray, calm, and unremarkable. It was sitting on one of the lower conduit housings in a way that suggested injury. One wing held at a bad angle, the head cocked, the small bright eyes moving between 977 and the possible exits. 977 looked at it for a long time. He had not seen a living bird since childhood, and even then only through the compound's exterior observation panels, which were thick polymer and positioned high on the exterior walls, and gave you a view of the sky approximately the size of a textbook page. He didn't know precisely what he was feeling looking at this bird. The feeling didn't have a name in the vocabulary he'd been given. It was somewhere between recognition and grief, and it was so large that for a moment the conduit seemed to tilt. He reached out. The bird let him. He held it carefully in both hands. It weighed almost nothing. It was almost nothing, just hollow bones and fear and something beating, and sat with it in the amber light of the sublevel for a long time. A camera blinked at him from the conduit junction 10 meters away. He set the bird down gently in a dry alcove behind the housing where the camera's angle couldn't reach. It was such a small act. It was the smallest possible act. It changed nothing and would never be known and amounted to nothing in the great grinding machinery of the compound's efficiency. He couldn't even have told you why he did it. That was the first deviation. The hunt happened every 2 weeks. The architects had designed it carefully. It was called recreation, officially, scheduled physical recreation, Category B, subtype competitive, and it took place in the compound's large interior exercise space, a 100-meter square hall with high easings and movable partition walls that could be reconfigured into any number of obstacle geometries. The executors were divided into groups. Each group was issued a weapon, a calibrated pulse emitter, shaped like a sidearm, which triggered the safety indicator every executor wore clipped to their coverall. A hit registered on the indicator. Too many hits and you were eliminated from the round. The weapons caused no physical harm, but the architects had decided that the readiness to harm was a resource that needed cultivation. 977 was good at the hunt. He moved quietly, read angles well, had patience that most executors, who were conditioned toward compliance, not cunning, found unnerving. He'd won his division simulation 12 consecutive cycles. The overseers noted it in his record with a designation that translated, roughly, to asset, kinetic potential high. He had never thought about what that designation meant. It was just a number in a file. On the 13th cycle, he was paired with a new grouping that included Unit 1041, a young executor, probably 20, with the particular kind of stillness that meant someone who had learned very early to be invisible. 977 had been that age once. He recognized the stillness the way you recognize a word in a language you used to speak. They moved through the partitions together without discussing it, which was unusual. Executors did not coordinate during the hunt. Coordination implied communication. Communication implied relationship. Relationship implied preference. And preference implied that the compound's random assignment systems were inadequate. And the compound's random assignment systems were never inadequate. But 977 gestured left and 1041 went left and 977 went right, and they flanked a group of 3 and ended the round in 4 minutes. Afterward, in the brief, unstructured interval before reassignment, 1041 said quietly, "You're good at this. It's a simulation," 977 said. "I know," said 1041, and the way he said it meant, "So what are we really training for?" 977 had no answer for that. He had never let himself form the question. But he was forming it now. And it had the same weight as the bird in the conduit, hollow bones and something beating, and it didn't go away when the tone sounded and they went back to their boxes. The physical hours were the part of the schedule that the compound's designers were most proud of, in the way institutions are proud of things they've euphemized successfully. Every 4th day at 1800, designated executors were assigned pairings. The assignments rotated on a schedule calculated to minimize, the documentation said, unproductive emotional dependency. You reported to the designated meeting space. You fulfilled your biological function. You returned to your box. 9 and 77 had done this without complaint for 31 years. The way you do anything you've never been told you have the right to refuse. The time he did not go to his assigned pairing, it wasn't because of a decision. It was because he was sitting in the sub-level again, in the amber conduit light, and the bird was still there, had been there 4 days, had been eating something he left from his meal ration, and the 1800 tone sounded, and he simply did not move. He sat with the bird, and the bird sat with him, and the camera at the junction blinked and recorded his absence. And in the administration office somewhere, a flag appeared on the screen of an overseer who hadn't expected it. He was brought before the panel the next morning. The panel, 3 overseers behind a desk. The desk was the same gray polymer as everything else. The overseers wore the same gray coveralls as everyone else, differentiated only by a white designation stripe on the left shoulder. They had the look of people who had long since stopped being curious about the answers to the questions they asked. Executor 977, the central overseer said, "You failed to report for physical hour on cycle 341, day 4. This is your first documented compliance failure in 31 years of service. The panel is prepared to consider a contextual explanation." 977 looked at the camera in the upper corner of the room. He had been composing an explanation during the walk here. Something about a maintenance requirement. A malfunction he had been monitoring. Something that sounded like compliance without being compliance. He was very good at this. He had been doing it his whole life, except in the sub-level with the bird, where for 4 days he had been something other than good at compliance. He said, "There was a bird in the maintenance conduit. One of the overseers wrote something down. I was watching it," 977 said. "I didn't want to stop." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a system encountering input it has no category for. The central overseer looked at the one on the left. The one on the left looked at the documentation in front of them. The documentation presumably did not contain a response to this. Executor 977, the central overseer said, finally carefully. Emotional attachment to non-compat fauna is not a recognized function. I know, said 977. This panel does not record the behavior as hostile deviation at this time. The overseer continued, in a tone that meant, we are logging everything, and this conversation is already in your file. You are advised to prioritize assigned functions. You are scheduled for behavioral recalibration review in 14 days. 977 was dismissed. He went back to his box, lay down on his sleep surface, and looked at the camera. For the first time in 31 years, he did not perform the unconscious thing he had always performed when looking at the camera, the micro-relaxation, the slight softening of expression, the body's learned signal that it was not a threat. He just looked at it. Flat, level, the way the camera looked at him. He told 1041 about the bird. They were in the sub-level together. 1041 had been assigned to the same maintenance block, and 977 didn't plan to say anything. And then he was saying it, and 1041 was listening with the particular quality of attention that meant someone who had been waiting for exactly this conversation. I've been down here before, 1041 said when 977 finished. The filtration junction. I know the gap. You've seen it? I've used it. 977 looked at him. Sent things through, 1041 said. Small things, notes mostly. Written on insulation strip. I don't know if anyone finds them. He paused. I don't know why I do it. It feels like it matters. That something gets outside. Something gets outside. 977 hadn't thought about outside in years. He'd stopped letting himself. Outside was the sky visible through the observation panels in parceled rectangles. Outside was theoretical, administrative. A condition that applied to birds. It didn't apply to him. But 1041 said it the way you say a word that is also a door. And something shifted in 977's chest. Slow and seismic and permanent. And he knew, with the flat certainty of a man who has been waiting for something and finally identifies what it was, that he had already crossed whatever line there was to cross. He was just going to have to find out where it led. The hunt simulation 2 weeks later was different. 977 moved through it the same way he always did. But this time he was thinking about the pulse emitters, about the safety indicators. About how the system had been designed to let its executors practice killing each other without actually killing each other. Because the architects had decided that the practice was the point, that you could cultivate willingness without cultivating harm. What they had not considered, because systems built around compliance don't consider this, was that they had also cultivated skill. 31 years of simulations, 12 consecutive wins. A file designation that read, kinetic potential high. 977 had never asked what they intended to do with that potential. He was asking now. After the hunt in the unstructured interval, he moved through the competitor pool with his usual quiet efficiency, speaking to no one, noted by no one, and lifted 2 pulse emitters from the equipment return, tucking them under his coverall with the practiced ease of a man who had, apparently, been developing useful skills for 3 decades without fully understanding why. He left them in the sub-level behind the housing where the bird had been. The bird was gone by then, healed probably or not. But the alcove was there, small and dry, and the camera couldn't see it. And 977 had been good at maintenance long enough to know which junctions were, on which camera loops, and where the gaps were. He worked systematically, quietly, without hurry. 1041 helped him. On the 32nd day after his appearance before the panel, before the behavioral recalibration review could be conducted, Overseer Central issued a different order. 977 was called before a different room. No stick this time, just a single overseer and 2 compliance officers in the undecorated intake space near the compound's exterior lock. The overseer was older. She had the look of someone who had risen through the administration by being correct more often than she was wrong, and who had learned to recognize the specific shape of something that was going to become a problem. Executor 977, she said, your recent behavioral pattern has been reviewed at the compound level. The panel's original assessment has been revised. 977 said nothing. You are designated a destabilizing presence, she said. Exposure to the general executor population is assessed as a compounding risk. She said this the way you read a weather report. Not cruel, worse than cruel, because cruelty requires engagement. You are to be transferred to the exterior, the forest, the real hunt. He had known this was a possibility. You'd have to be stupid not to know. And the compound had made many things of him, but not that. He'd known since the sublevel, since the bird, since 1041 said something gets outside. He had been knowing it and moving toward it at the same time, because the alternative was to stop and go back inside and continue being a number in a file until the file was closed. He looked at the overseer. He didn't perform the soft relaxation. He didn't give her the micro-signal his body had learned. "How much time do I have?" he said. She blinked. Nobody asked that. "Before they deploy the hunters," he said, "when I go through the exterior lock. How long before they send them after me?" A pause. She checked her documentation, because the documentation was where reality lived for her. "Standard protocol is a 2-hour head start," she said, before she could stop herself. "The objective is a realistic pursuit, not an immediate." She stopped, looked at him. "Why are you asking?" "Because I wanted to know," 977 said. They put him through the exterior lock at 0800. The door was thick composite, designed to prevent contamination both ways, and it exhaled a faint mechanical sigh when it opened, like something that had been holding its breath. Beyond it was a corridor and then another door, and then, without ceremony, without transition, without anything except the absence of polymer walls and overhead cameras, the world. 977 stood at the edge of it and breathed. It had a smell he had forgotten or had never properly known. Every childhood memory of outside had been mediated by polymer and distance. But it had a smell, vast and green and wet and complicated, nothing like the recycled hunting of the compound, nothing like anything that could be engineered or stripped or calibrated. It hit him in the chest like a fist, like something waking up. He gave himself 4 seconds of it. Then he moved. He had 2 pulse emitters. He had, from the maintenance work, a rough topological understanding of the compound's exterior, where the tree lines ran, where the elevation changed, which directions the camera towers faced. He had 31 years of hunt simulations, 12 consecutive wins, and a file designation he was now, finally, putting to its intended use. He moved northeast into the trees, fast but not frantic. Frantic was how prey moved. He was done being prey. The forest closed over him. It was nothing like the hunt space. The hunt space had clean geometry, engineered sight lines, predictable cover. This was chaos, patient and old. Roots that grabbed your feet, light that scattered through canopy into patterns that confused depth perception, ground that changed without warning from solid to soft. A system optimized for compliance doesn't train you for chaos. 977 had been trained for something else. Slowly, accidentally, by 31 years of maintenance work in the compound's forgotten corners. He knew how to move through spaces the system didn't watch, how to think about angles and absence, and the difference between what was visible and what was there. He found water at 920. A stream moving north, maybe half a meter deep, cold enough to ache. He followed it for an hour, moving in the water itself. Not because he'd read about it in any manual, but because the logic was plain. If they were tracking him, they were tracking ground sign, and you can't leave sign in moving water. He emerged at a granite shelf where the stream dropped away and the elevation rose sharply through birch trees. He climbed. His legs hurt. He was 31 years old and had spent those years in a maintenance coverall, in a compound that had decided vigorous, physical exertion was unnecessary for most executors, and his body was making its objections known clearly. He climbed anyway. From the top of the shelf, he could see through the trees to the south, the gray external surface of the compound, blank and functional, a wall that was also a philosophy. He looked at it for a moment. 2 hours ago, he had been on the other side of it, and the distance between those two versions of himself felt enormous and irreversible, like something had been cut. Good. He heard them at 1100. 3 pursuit units, moving in a loose spread. Too loud because they'd been trained for the hunt space and the forest's chaos was slowing them. He knew their training because it was his training. He knew how they thought about angles. He had 2 pulse emitters that were technically for simulations. He had 31 years of being good at this. He waited. The first one came through a birch stand where the ground dropped into shadow, and he was behind them. And the pulse hit the safety indicator before the unit had finished processing the sound. 1. The second was 20 seconds behind and to the left, and he was already moving, and the shot was longer, and he didn't rush it, and it connected, and the safety indicator lit. 2. The third unit stopped, took cover behind a fallen trunk. Smart patient. 977 waited. He was good at waiting. He was better at waiting. The third unit shifted after 4 minutes. A small adjustment that moved their shoulder into a sight line. He took it. 3. He stood in birchwood with the 2 pulse emitters and the 3 executors sitting on the ground with their safety indicators blinking. And for a long time there was no sound except the wind and the forest's enormous indifferent breathing. "You're not supposed to win," one of them said. "Unit 304, he recognized the voice from Hunt simulations. "Decent shot, poor patience." "I know," said 977. "This isn't a simulation. I know that too." 304 looked at him from the ground. The safety indicator on their coverall was blinking a steady amber. In the simulation, that meant you sat down and waited for the round to reset. Out here, there was no reset. Out here, it was just amber light in the morning forest, and three executors sitting in the leaves, and a man standing over them who had apparently decided something they hadn't decided yet. "What happens now?" 304 asked. 977 looked back toward the compound through the trees. Then he looked at the forest in the other direction. North, where the stream went, where the elevation kept rising, where the cameras didn't reach. He thought about 1041. About the notes pushed through the filtration gap, about something gets outside. He thought about a bird that weighed almost nothing and had hollow bones and had let him hold it in the amber light of a sub-level corridor. "They're going to send more," he said, "better equipped. Probably with real weapons." He looked at 304. "You could come with me, or you could go back." 304 said nothing for a long time. The forest moved around them, that vast, complicated smell everywhere. "You can't survive out here indefinitely," said the second unit. Unit 688, younger, quieter. "Probably not," 977 agreed. "Then, what's the point?" 977 thought about that. He'd been thinking about it in various forms since the sub-level, since the bird, since 1041's note in the filtration gap, going out into a world that might not receive it, carrying nothing but the fact of its own existence. What's the point of a thing that costs everything and changes nothing? Except that wasn't right. That wasn't the right question. The right question was, what are you, if you don't ask it? "I'll have been free," he said. "Whatever happens next, I'll have had that. They can't take it back." Another long silence. 688 stood up slowly, brushing leaves from their coverall. "That's not a tactical argument," they said. "No," said 977. 688 looked at the forest to the north, then back at the compound to the south. "Okay," they said. 304 stood up too, said nothing. Just stood there in the birchwood with their safety indicators still blinking amber, and after a moment they nodded once, and that was enough. The compound sent 12 units the next morning, better equipped as 977 had predicted. Pulse weapons upgraded to actual impact, body armor, tracking equipment calibrated for forest terrain. The overseer had clearly revised her assessment of what constituted adequate pursuit for a problem that had turned into a different shape than expected. 977 watched them deploy from the ridgeline through birch trees. He had spent the night moving. He'd slept 40 minutes, briefly, in a rock shelter above the stream, and 688 and 304 had taken watches, and they'd eaten nothing because there was nothing to eat yet, and in the morning they were cold and hungry and tired. He watched the 12-wood units move into the forest below, and felt something he spent a moment identifying, and identified as, "This is exactly what was always going to happen, and it is exactly what I chose, and I chose it anyway." He felt around in the sub-level part of his mind, the part that moved through spaces the system didn't watch, and found the only thing that was going to work. He didn't know the forest, but he knew the compound. He knew every system in its walls. He knew where the cameras didn't reach, and which junctions ran, on which circuits, and where the compliance architecture had the small human-shaped gaps that accrue in any system managed by people who have been trained not to ask questions. And he had two people who had access cards that still read as active. 1041 was on maintenance rotation in sub-level 4 when the filtration junction opened and a note came through. It was written on insulation strip, in the same way 1041 had always written his own. The handwriting was 977's. Tight, efficient, the handwriting of someone who had been good at documentation his whole life. The note said, "Northeast exterior lock, 2300. Leave it unsecured for 4 minutes." "This is all I'm asking." 1041 looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the camera at the junction. Then, very carefully, he folded the note and put it inside his coverall. He went back to work. He completed his tasking. His efficiency score for the cycle was 98%. He reported for physical hour and was compliant and present. He ate his meal and returned to his box and lay on his sleep surface, and looked at the overhead camera with an expression that meant nothing except, "I am Executor 1041, and my compliance metrics are fine." At 2250, he went to maintenance sub-level 4 on a ticket he had generated himself. False, technically, but indistinguishable from the real ones in the system, because he had been paying attention to the system his whole life in exactly the way that the system did not intend. At 2258, he reached the northeast exterior lock circuit panel. At 22:59, he held his hands very still and thought about a man who had held a bird in amber light and decided it mattered. At 2300, the lock disengaged. 977 came through the gap with 688 and 304, and they moved fast through the interior corridors. Three people who were ghosts in the system, tracked and not tracked, visible and not visible. And the 4 minutes were exactly enough because 977 had calculated exactly what 4 minutes could contain. They reached sub-level 4 and found 1041 standing by the circuit panel, with the particular stillness of someone who had decided something and was at peace with it. 977 looked at him. 4 months since the hunt. Since something gets outside, you should have stayed clean, 977 said. Your metrics, I know what my metrics are. 1041 said, I know what they mean. A pause. I've been sending notes through that gap for 2 years. Never knew if anyone got them. He looked at 977 directly, the way people look at each other when the cameras and the compliance architecture are beside the point. Seems like someone did. There were 6 of them by the time they reached the exterior again. 2 more executors had found reasons to be in the corridors at 2310, and neither 977 nor anyone else had recruited them. They had simply been there. The way things are there when the conditions for them have been building for a long time. The forest received them. Not kindly, the forest wasn't kind. It was indifferent and complicated and cold, and they were 6 people in gray coveralls with 2 pulse emitters and 4 maintenance tools and approximately no plan beyond this moment. The compound would know by morning. The overseers would revise their assessment again, upward, and the pursuit would be different next time. 977 knew this. He stood at the tree line and looked back at the compound's exterior. Blank gray polymer, camera towers, the architecture of a world that had given him a number and a function and a transparent box to sleep in. Then he turned north. The stream was up there somewhere. The granite shelf, the birch trees with their white paper bark. He had been free for 2 days and a night, and he was cold and hungry, and the compound was going to send everything it had, and the odds were the kind of odds that a compliance metric could not contain. He started walking. Behind him, without discussion, without a signal, one by one the others followed. The forest closed over them. That enormous smell, wet earth and green things and rains somewhere distant, came from all directions. Nothing like the recycled nothing of the compound, nothing like anything that could be engineered or stripped away. 977 breathed it. Up ahead, through the birch trunks, the sky was beginning to go from black to deep gray, the way it does before the sun arrives. Not light yet, just the promise of it, the world reminding you it still turns. He hadn't seen a sunrise in 31 years. He hadn't known he was missing it. He walked toward it. He had a number and a file and a compliance record and a designation and a history as long as his life of being exactly what the compound needed him to be. He was going to be something else now. He wasn't sure yet what that meant. He wasn't sure there was a word for it in the vocabulary he'd been given. But there had been a bird, once in a sub-level corridor, that weighed almost nothing and had hollow bones and had let him hold it. And when he set it down in the alcove out of the camera's line of sight, it had looked at him with one bright eye, and then looked at the gap in the filtration grate, and it had known exactly what to do next. 977 knew too. He walked into the rising light, and the trees received him, and behind him the gray architecture of the compound grew smaller and then disappeared, and ahead of him the world opened up in all directions, vast and unmanaged and smelling of everything. And for the first time in 31 years, no camera watched him take another step.